A group of angry Americans gather in a town square despite the cold night air. Some carry torches, one grasps a rope. Many come with nothing but deep-seated hatred for one man in their hearts. A man arrives carrying a life-size effigy. The crowd erupts into ecstatic cheers while this effigy is strung up on a nearby tree. They cheer even louder when the figure is set alight. The wind will carry their jubilations through the land. While it might sound like I'm conjuring up some mythical representation of American patriots showing their displeasure at unjust British policies, that's not the case. These Americans were burning the likeness of one of their own, a man who had done much to bring their country into existence, John Jay. Welcome to America's Forgotten Founders, where we will look at people whose contributions to the American Revolution, whether on the battlefield, in the halls of power, or on the home front, have been all but forgotten by the annals of history. John Jay was born on December 23, 1745, in New York City to the wealthy Franco-Dutch merchant Peter Jay and his wife Mary Van Cortlandt. Much of his family's wealth had come from the slave trade. Though he never personally participated in the slave trade, Jay owned 17 slaves throughout his life, despite being a staunch abolitionist. 3 months after his birth, his father retired and moved the whole family to the small town of Rye, New York. They lived on a 400-acre farm overlooking Long Island Sound. All was not well with Jay's siblings. 2 of them were severely mentally ill, another 2 were rendered blind by smallpox. After their father's death, Jay would both emotionally and financially support all 4 of them. His elder brother, James Jay, was never close to the rest of the family. During the Revolution, James would side with Great Britain, eventually being ennobled. When told of his brother's defection, an enraged John would write, "If after making so much bustle in and for America, he has, as it is surmised, improperly made his peace with Britain, I shall endeavor to forget that my father has such a son." In many ways, John was his parents' only child. His mother educated him until he was 8. He was then sent to a private Huguenot boarding school near New Rochelle. He would only remain at the school for 2 years. By age 10, John was back home, being taught by his mother and private tutors. Throughout his time at home and in boarding school, the young Jay became devoutly religious. His religious beliefs would weigh heavily on his later politics. He applied and was accepted to King's College, now Columbia University, when he was just 14 years old. For all his intellectual prowess, he was never comfortable speaking in public. He was very private and closed off. His classmates often poked fun at him for his inability to pronounce the letter L properly. When he successfully graduated at 18, the lanky 6-foot-tall Jay clerked for Benjamin Kissam, a prominent New York lawyer. He would clerk for Kissam for 4 years, and in October 1768, Jay was accepted to the bar. After briefly running a law firm with his collegiate friend, Robert Livingston, Jay started his own practice in 1771. By 1774, the young man became the wealthiest lawyer in the city. Around this time, he met the outgoing fashionista, 16-year-old Sarah Van Brugh Livingston, a relative to his friend Robert. Though the 2 were opposites in terms of personality, they fell in love and wed on April 28, 1774. The happy couple would go on to have 6 children. Before the fighting began, the taciturn Jay largely remained out of the growing conflict between the American colonists and the British, focusing instead on his legal practice. Nonetheless, the wealthy and well-connected Jay was part of New York's delegation to the First Continental Congress. He was a moderate, much like the rest of those in attendance. He favored nonviolent resistance to British taxation and advocated for a negotiated settlement to the worsening political crisis. He wrote to a friend during the first Congress, "God knows how the contest will end. I sincerely wish it may terminate in a lasting union with Great Britain." In an effort to preserve that union, Jay, along with Robert Livingston and John Dickinson, authored what would be known as the Olive Branch Petition, laying out their grievances, but emphasizing their desire to remain united with Great Britain. John firmly believed that the colonists deserved to have their rights respected. Although some portrayed John as undergoing an ideological shift, the document ended with the threat that the colonists will never submit to be hewers of wood or drawers of water for any ministry or nation in the world. John was not willing to go to war over taxation. He merely wanted the colonists to be treated with respect and dignity, like their British counterparts. He wanted his fellow Americans to be seen as equals, not second-class citizens. Jay was also fearful of mob rule. He firmly believed the landed elite should run the country. Those who own the country ought to govern it, he said. Events well outside of Jay's control did begin to change his mind, at least about the feasibility of peaceful reconciliation with Great Britain. Despite New York's delegation voting against independence, Jay convinced the New York Provincial Congress just 3 days later that they must join with the other colonies in supporting independence because the cruel necessity of events made independence unavoidable. Those words swayed the men present. The motion was passed by unanimous consent. Much like Robert Morris, Jay understood that when the colonies crossed the Rubicon, there was no turning back. They must stand together or fall alone. As the war began, Jay spent the first 2 years in New York, writing the new state's constitution and serving as the Chief Justice of New York's Supreme Court. He also wrote tirelessly to the public about the need for the colonies to remain united and to see the conflict to a successful conclusion, writing in one op-ed, "If there be one single idea of peace in King George's mind, why does he order your cities to be burned, your country to be desolated, your brethren to starve and languish and die in prison?" After being appointed to the Second Continental Congress in December 1778, Jay was immediately elected as President of Congress from December 10, 1778 to September 28, 1779. I'll let one of his biographers describe his time as president. The position was, in some ways, a frustrating one for Jay. It brought with it some prestige, a great deal of responsibility, and very little real authority. Despite not being eager about the position, Jay admirably fulfilled his duties as President of Congress. One of his primary responsibilities was to stay in contact with foreign and domestic leaders, so that Congress was kept abreast of military and political developments. To this end, he began a regular correspondence with General George Washington. Even though Congress could not always provide support to the general's army, the two men forged a strong friendship. The day before his term as President of Congress officially ended, Jay was tapped to serve as U.S. Minister to Spain. He agreed, setting sail within a month with Sarah and their first son Peter in tow. Despite Spain officially being at war with Great Britain, Spain was far more interested in their own affairs in the New World than in actually supporting the Americans. Unlike France, King Carlos III refused to formally ally with the United States. Spain was a colonial power, and the Spanish elite feared what would happen in their own colonies if they officially recognized the United States as an independent nation that broke away from their overlords. Years later, it would turn out that these fears were well-founded. It must have come as a great relief to Jay when, in early May 1782, he was summoned to Paris by Benjamin Franklin to help negotiate peace with the British. Shortly after arriving in France, Jay, along with Franklin, Henry Laurens, and John Adams, elected to negotiate directly with the British and avoid their Spanish and French allies. British Prime Minister Lord Shelburne agreed. Lord Shelburne wanted to end the war. Great Britain couldn't afford to keep fighting the United States and Spain and France and the Netherlands a decade after the French and Indian War. The war in America was growing increasingly unpopular among both the British elite and the public. He needed a political solution. It turned out that Jay would, in the words of Adams, be of more importance than any of the rest of us during these negotiations. Franklin and Adams didn't get along with one another. Franklin was outgoing and loud, whereas Adams was quiet and rather awkward. Despite Jay being on the quiet side, he was able to hold the American delegation together and leverage both men for their strengths. Despite Lord Shelburne wanting to end negotiations quickly, he offered the Americans independence in July 1782. The talks stalled because Jay wanted the British to recognize America as an independent nation during the negotiations, not only after the fact. While it took a few months for this issue to be ironed out, once it was, the treaty quickly took shape. Both sides got what they wanted. The U.S. got their independence and grew in size, being recognized to encompass all of the area east of the Mississippi River, north of Florida, and south of Canada, and obtained fishing rights off of Nova Scotia. In return, the United States agreed to settle all private debts from before the war and return or compensate the Loyalists whose property was seized during the war. The U.S. also signed a two-way trade agreement with Great Britain, which was Lord Shelburne's primary goal. Why pay for an expensive war when you can simply profit from trade regardless? The parties signed the treaty on September 3, 1783. While Jay was in Paris, one of his slaves, Abby, attempted to escape. She was caught. At Franklin's recommendation, Jay insisted she remain in prison as punishment. She would quickly die of illness in the unsanitary and overcrowded prisons of Paris. One of Jay's more prominent biographers, Walter Starr, summarized the event like this. However much he disliked slavery in the abstract, he could not understand why one of his slaves would want to run away. Shortly after the ink had dried on the treaty, Jay and his family returned to the United States. Almost immediately upon landing, Jay was asked to serve as Secretary of Foreign Affairs for the Continental Congress. He agreed. Though he did his best in this new role, serving until 1790, he grew increasingly frustrated. He had no authority to enforce the very treaty he had just negotiated. He gradually became a staunch advocate for a stronger national government. Though he was not selected as one of New York's 3 official delegates to the Constitutional Convention, John Jay remained in close contact with George Washington, the president of the convention. Through this connection, Jay was able to stay informed of the proceedings and ensure that his thoughts and his opinions were taken into consideration. The resultant document ultimately reflected many of his beliefs. When his largely anti-federalist home state of New York hesitated to sign the new United States Constitution, John Jay acted. In collaboration with James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, Jay penned 5 anonymous essays for the Federalist Papers, trying to convince his fellow citizens of the need to replace the Confederation system. Here is an excerpt from one of those essays. The Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, may make war, but are not empowered to raise men or money to carry it on. They may make peace, but without power to see the terms of the peace observed. They may form alliances, but without ability to comply with the stipulations on their part. They may enter into treaties of commerce, but without power to enforce them at home or abroad. In the end, John Jay would prevail, however narrowly. New York would become the 11th state to ratify the U.S. Constitution on July 26, 1788, by a vote of 34 and 27 against. In September 1789, John Jay refused his friend Washington's offer to serve as the first Secretary of State. Washington then offered Jay the position of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and Jay accepted. He was sworn in on October 19, 1789, after being unanimously confirmed by the Senate, becoming the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. During the court's first 3 years, there was little to do except establish procedure. Jay used his free time to support Washington's administration. There were no rules yet in place prohibiting judges engaging in politics. The most significant case Jay presided over was the 1793 case of Chisholm versus Georgia. In this case, the court ruled 4-1 in favor of 2 loyalists who had their property confiscated during the Revolution. The decision was incredibly unpopular, leading to the adoption of the 11th Amendment to the Constitution, stating that the judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law or equity commenced or prosecuted against one of the United States by citizens of another state or by citizens or subjects of any foreign state. In plain English, individuals, whether foreign or domestic, could not sue states in federal court. Despite being Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John ran for election in 1792 for the governorship of New York. Despite winning more votes, surprising in an anti-federalist state, he lost the election on a technicality. Look it up. It is fascinating stuff. In the spring of 1794, under immense foreign and domestic pressure, President Washington asked his friend to travel to Europe and broker a treaty ensuring peace and stability with Great Britain. France and Great Britain were at war, and both sides were boarding American vessels and seizing cargo. Britain was taking it one step further by forcibly enlisting American sailors into the Royal Navy. That's a very basic oversimplification of all the ideological and political issues underscoring Anglo-American and Franco-American relations at the time. Again, for more details, look it up. But when this treaty's terms became public, it sparked a firestorm that divided the new country. While the treaty was mutually beneficial, Jay was harshly criticized in the Jeffersonian press for not addressing their concerns. Many in the South expressed frustration that Jay had declined to ask the British to compensate American slaveholders for slaves that were freed during the Revolution. The treaty did not address the issue of impressment. One Jeffersonian-aligned newspaper subtly wrote, "John Jay, the arch-traitor, seize him, drown him, burn him, flay him alive." His house was covered with graffiti. One of the messages was as follows: "Damn John Jay. Damn everyone who won't damn John Jay. Damn everyone that won't put lights in his windows and sit up all night damning John Jay." If this hatred bothered Jay, he didn't show it. He joked to friends that he could travel by night all the way from Boston to Philadelphia just by the light of his burning effigies. Ironically, as it would turn out, Jay was elected governor of New York while negotiating the treaty in London. When he returned to the States, he resigned from the Supreme Court and served as governor of New York from July 1st, 1796 to June 30th, 1801. Despite his best efforts, the treaty he negotiated was incredibly unpopular in his home state, and it quickly destroyed his political capital. He was a rump governor. After his uneventful term, John Jay opted to retire from public life. He and his wife moved to a farm in Westchester County, New York. Sarah died not long after the couple arrived. John Jay would only become involved in politics once after the end of his governorship. In 1819, when Missouri attempted to join the United States as a slave state, Jay, a lifelong abolitionist, at least in principle, spoke out against the idea in the press. Slavery ought not to be introduced nor permitted in any of the new states. His efforts were in vain. After a stroke, John Jay died on May 17, 1829, in Bedford, New York, at the age of 83. He was buried at his request in his childhood home of Rye. John Jay, like us all, was a man of contradiction. While he truly believed that every man of every color and description has a natural right to freedom, He also believed that those who owned the country ought to govern it. How, then, could every man of every color and description be free when governed by men who looked down on them, owned them as property, and viewed them as inferior? While he ultimately negotiated the treaty that would recognize the independence of the United States of America, he delayed the negotiations for several months over a point of pride. How many thousands of people died needless deaths because of his stubbornness. He served as the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court and laid the foundation for an institution that would come to be one of the three main pillars of our national government. He served his president faithfully and preserved peace with Great Britain in 1794. Yet he did so in a way that furthered the already deep partisan divides in the new nation, helping to drive his fellow Americans further apart rather than pull them closer together. Whatever his shortcomings, John Jay played a crucial role in establishing and ensuring the continued existence of the young United States of America. I hope you found this video both informative and exciting. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. And join us next time as we look at our next forgotten figure, the attendant to the Marquis de Lafayette, a courier and double agent, James Armistead Lafayette.